All right, so welcome back. So now let's go through Chapter 11 of Universal Economics, which gets into some illustrative applications of demand principles. So far, the idea that we've presented is that prices can rapidly adjust to clear the market. However, in many instances in the real world, we don't see this happening all that quickly. So why is that? Even in the age of COVID, it's common to wait in line at restaurants. But one thing we've discussed is that prices adjust to clear markets. That there are more people who are willing to eat at a restaurant at a given price than there are seats at that restaurant tells us something about the relative values of the quantity demand versus the quantity supplied. So if there are people who are willing to stand in line for a product, well, that must mean that the quantity demand is greater than the quantity supplied. And if we plot this on a supply and demand graph, what we can see is that the price must actually be below the market clearing value. So in order to get a quantity demand greater than quantity supplied, where we have to see the price would be down here, right? Because this means that the quantity demanded is here and the quantity supplied is here. In other words, the price is too low. So why don't restaurants charge higher prices during busy times and lower prices during non-busy times? Now, before you laugh at this as being absurd, keep in mind that movie theaters do this all the time. It's cheaper to see a movie on a random Tuesday morning than it is to see the movie on a Friday or Saturday night, and not just by a little bit either. And restaurants even do this too. Have you ever noticed that the lunch prices are typically lower than dinner prices? So we know that industries can and do charge different prices for things in response to how busy they are. And we know that restaurants can charge different prices anyway. So why don't restaurants simply increase their menu prices when the line gets longer until enough people leave such that nobody is actually waiting for a table? Well, by not doing this, the prices become stable and therefore predictable. Customers value predictable prices because it lets them better decide what they're going to do that evening. Producers like predictable prices because it helps them better predict revenue. But the extent to which a price is stable and therefore predictable depends on the cost of holding inventories and the value of timing the delivery. So for example, at high-end restaurants, there is often something like lobster or some other fancy fish on the menu. The price that's listed in the menu is often simply two words: market price. For these types of foods, the cost of holding them, even overnight, is too high because the fish will either go bad or have to be frozen in some way, which will degrade its taste. For foods like hamburgers, which are made with just simply ground beef, the cost of holding ground beef overnight is pretty much negligible. Often, the beef has already been frozen once, and so refreezing it doesn't affect the taste hardly at all. As another example, we can think of the common grocery store. Have you ever walked into a grocery store and seen it completely empty? Barring some extreme situations, my guess is no. So why is this? So let's put on our economic hats and see if we can figure out what's going on. So here we have the same supply and demand graph as before, right? D1, supply 1, and our equilibrium market clearing price, and the corresponding quantity. Okay. Now, if there's more product on the shelf than there are people buying it, then that says that the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So we need to find a price where that would be true. And that's the case when the price is actually too high. So here, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So why don't grocery stores simply lower their prices, reduce their inventories, and carry only what they expect to sell each day, or perhaps each week? So how many of you have actually called the grocery store, let's say a couple of days in advance, and given them a specific list of the products that you want to purchase and when you'll be there. Prior to the pandemic and the rise of curbside delivery, this almost never happened. Why is this? Well, it would have been weird and also somewhat inconvenient. Have you ever gone into a grocery store and found something that you weren't looking for when you walked in? My guess is yes. And so the grocery store holds more food than it expects to sell because they know that customers often, 1, come in with a vague notion of what they want, not a specific notion, 2, like to compare different brands side by side, and 3, sometimes they find things that they weren't even looking for. Having excess inventories accommodates this and provides better service to the customers. Yes, sometimes it means that some food gets thrown out, but usually not before being marked down in price. But overall, customers are happy with this and are willing to pay just a little bit extra, which covers the cost of the unsold food, in order to have this increased convenience. Okay, so now we have a little bit of an understanding for why we might not see prices adjust for any given industry. In restaurants, the price is actually held low because it generates stable and predictable prices which everyone values. In the grocery store, the price is actually too high, which means that there are excess inventories, but that's okay because we as customers are willing to pay for the convenience of being able to shop around in the form of marginally higher prices. But we do know that prices can and do change, but most prices change really slowly. For example, toilet paper prices changed remarkably slowly, at least at physical stores, during the beginning months of the pandemic in 2020. As a result, most physical stores completely ran out as people, for some reason, started hoarding toilet paper. Why didn't the stores raise prices during the beginning stages of the pandemic? Well, there's 2 reasons. First, it's often difficult to distinguish a genuine change in demand from just random fluctuations in the quantity demanded on a given day. So for example, if you as the store owner knew that you sold 100 rolls of toilet paper, plus or minus, let's say 30, and you saw a day where 130 toilet paper packs were sold, you might conclude that this was just a random occurrence and not a genuine increase in the actual demand. Even if you saw 150 packs in a day sold for many days in a row, that could still be random coincidence. Given that stable and therefore predictable prices are often more valuable than the small increase in revenue you might get by minutely adjusting prices, you might still just leave prices steady, if only to avoid the cost of actually changing the prices in the register, on the sticker, and on the signage. The second reason is that in many states there are laws on the books that explicitly say that prices are not allowed to rise during times of crisis. Typically, these are meant to apply in, for example, natural disasters. COVID was and is clearly a disaster, but is it the same type of disaster as a natural disaster such as a tornado or hurricane? It might be, but even if it's not, it might make sense for stores to behave as if it were, even if only to avoid legal liability. Alternatively, we could recognize that it's simply gauche to raise prices during a disaster, regardless of what kind of disaster it is, and to instead institute strict rationing. For example, you could limit the purchase of any good to 2 per customer or some other number. In doing so, you avoid potentially offending your customers who you wish to have come back in the future and shop with you again. You might lose a little bit of money today that you could have earned, but you'll gain much more goodwill, which will go a much longer way in the future. So here what we want to do is we want to take one step beyond principles economics. So in your principles classes, you probably got a list of factors that shift the supply curve and a list of factors that shift the demand curve. one of the factors that shifts demand was probably something like a change in the price of a substitute good or a change in the price of a complementary good. And you were told that if the price of a substitute goes up, then the demand for the other good will increase. For example, if the price of Pepsi were to increase, the demand for Coca-Cola would increase because Pepsi and Coca-Cola are pretty much substitutes. That's not false, but it's also not totally true. So in economics, prices don't just change. In order for the price to change, either the demand or the supply curve must change, which then, with time, will cause the price to adjust. So whenever we see a price change, we must first figure out whether that price change was the result of a demand shift or a supply shift. And once we've figured that out, we can then ask the question, what happened that caused that curve to actually shift? For example, in your principles class, you were taught that when the price of a complementary good rises, the demand for the other good decreases. This isn't totally true. It could be true, but it could also not be true. So for example, let's consider the market for hot dogs and hot dog buns. Most of us would probably agree that hot dogs and hot dog buns are complementary goods because we consume these goods together. Now, what if in your standard economics course or in your principles economics course, if you were told that the price of hot dogs increased, you would show this as a decrease in the demand for hot dog buns. After all, at higher prices, people will buy fewer hot dogs, and therefore they will need or require fewer hot dog buns to go with the smaller number of hot dogs that they're purchasing. But what if the reason that the price rose for hot dogs is because maybe we found out that hot dogs actually are really, really healthy for you? Well, what this would do is would cause the demand for hot dogs to increase, which means that we're going to buy more hot dogs and the price of hot dogs is going to go up. But because we're buying more hot dogs, we're going to need more hot dog buns. And so the demand for hot dog buns would also increase. So here, we've just shown what sounds like a violation of something you learned in your principles course. However, what you learned in your principles course, while not totally false, didn't convey the full picture. And remember, in economics, price doesn't just change. Ceteris is paribus, but price changes are the result of something else changing. Okay, so let's turn to a discussion of land development and see how this applies to the incidence of costs, or in other words, to who bears what costs. So let's suppose that a developer wishes to build an apartment complex on a parcel of land that they currently do not own. As a part of this, the developer will almost certainly include some parking spaces and some green areas because using the land for these things instead of using it for additional apartments or bigger apartments is probably going to be more valuable. The reason for this is because people generally like to be able to park their car at their apartment complex. In many areas, in order to get a building permit, the developer must provide more parking spaces and more green spaces than they might otherwise prefer to. In other words, in order to build the apartment complex, the developer must build more parking and more green space than is actually profitable for them. So who bears the cost? You might think that the occupants of the apartment complex will bear this cost in the form of higher prices for their apartments or the same price for smaller apartments. Alternatively, you might think that the developer must bear these costs in the form of lower profits from the apartment complex. In truth, however, it would be the original owner of the land who bears these costs. Why is that? The developer, knowing that they will not be able to use the land exactly as they wish, will now be less willing to pay for that parcel of land than they would be if they were allowed to do with it as they desired. Because of this, the price that they pay for the parcel of land will actually be lower. This is true regardless of whether the increased green space is a net positive to the community writ large. The original owner of the land bears this cost and is the only one who does so. An interesting question to think about would be, is this fair? Should the original landowner have to pay the cost of providing this benefit to society, or should society somehow pay for this benefit as a whole? Now, this is a normative question to be sure, but it's one that has really important implications. Now, alternatively, we could think about pollution. So suppose that we figure out a way to magically make all of the smog in Los Angeles disappear entirely and prevent it from ever coming back. No tricks, no gimmicks, it's all just gone as if it never existed. We're not just moving it somewhere else. Would this be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, let's consider who benefits and who loses. First, we should recognize that there are definitely some people who do not want to live in LA purely because of the smog. But if the smog were gone forever, then they would. So what would happen? Well, the demand for land in Los Angeles would increase as more people would want to move there. Rent in Los Angeles would increase, and so the existing renters in LA would lose in the sense that they now have to pay higher prices than they did before, and they're getting something that they either can't pay for or were willing to go without. In this case, smog-free air. Because remember, when you move into an apartment complex or any area whatsoever, you are implicitly saying that the dollar price and everything around you is worth that price. In places where there is smog, rent is lower because of the smog. This is the same phenomenon we see for housing near airports. The increased noise reduces the value of homes. But what that does is make it more affordable for people who are willing to incur the cost of the noise of the airplanes. To be sure, if you removed the airport, the people around the airport would be benefited. The value of their property would increase because there would be no noise pollution. However, the people who are renting there would now have to pay a higher price in order to rent that space because of the reduction in the noise. And what they had said before was that they were willing to incur the cost of the noise for the reduction in rent. Now, in our smog example, the newcomers or the people that moved to LA as a result of the smog abatement would clearly benefit. They can now move to LA and, if they do so, demonstrate that they are made better off by doing so. The current landlords who own the land and the apartment complexes there would also benefit from the increased value of their property and from the increased rent that they can charge renters. So is it fair that existing tenants in LA bear the cost of cleaning the air while the newcomers and existing landlords reap the benefits? Are the benefits bigger than the costs? Or are the costs bigger than the benefits? These are vitally important questions. But then we can think about nearby landowners. So what about people who own land near LA but far enough away that they do not have smog? Well, those people will lose too, because now there is less of a premium on their land since no areas have smog now. Is it fair that those people lose too? And how does this relate to issues of social justice and environmental sustainability?